Hello, I'm Carmen,
And I'm Steven, and welcome to Vienna Past and Present.
the podcast where we take you through the gilded and sometimes not so gilded halls of Vienna's history. So our topic for today is Dr. Karl Lueger.
Okay.
In preparation, we did briefly discuss it, but does that mean anything to you?
No, and you said you mentioned it before, so I wasn't listening. Okay?
I have mentioned him to you before,
Okay.
but it's a while ago, so I'll let you off the hook
All
this
right.
time. But I do want to get into him because he has quite an interesting background, and the very basics are that he was a mayor of Vienna
Okay.
at the turn of the century, so the late 1900s, late 1800s is what I mean, early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of controversial in his day, and I think he's only gotten more controversial over time.
Hmm.
And so there's sort of an ongoing discussion around him. And I wanted to a little bit get into the background. Who was he? And why is he even still part of the discussion today at all?
Yeah, wow, 100 years ago. Okay.
Yeah. So the very basics are he was the mayor of Vienna from 1897 until 1910. Do you know anything about Vienna around that time period? Like turn of the century. It's often called Fin de siècle Vienna. Does that mean anything to you?
I mean, no, it would just be stuff that I would sort of deduce from what's happening in other places. You know what I mean? I would be like, maybe like the seeds of World War One discontent, Austria plus Hungary is not going well, something like that.
Yes, kind of. But
Okay.
you always, there's always the peak before the fall, right?
Okay.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think Vienna during this time kind of embodies that. Of course, there's the seeds of World War One already there, but the turn of the century period was really the height of Vienna in a lot of ways. The city was booming, the population was growing extremely quickly. It was actually, the population was around 2 million people in the city. And
Wow.
only, I think, just 2 months ago or something, did the city reach that number again.
Hmm.
So only recently has Vienna had 2 million inhabitants again. And the last time that that happened was exactly during this period when Dr. Karl Lueger was the mayor around the turn of the century. So you had lots of people moving into the city growing very quickly. The whole coffee house culture really comes from this time as well.
Yeah, okay. All right, so like revolutionaries at coffee houses, okay, in this like opulent capital. All right.
Exactly. So revolutionaries to some extent, but like intellectuals for the most part.
Okay.
The coffee houses was where they would come together, they would read the paper, they would talk about what was going on, they would philosophize about current topics, or just, philosophy in general. And hanging out in the coffee shop was really what the people, well, what I would say the middle class of people, to the extent that that really existed. It was also a time where the middle class was kind of starting to exist and establish itself. And so
Okay.
people were hanging out in the coffee shops. But then at the same time, like I said, the city's growing massively. You have lots of workers coming into the city. And so you have this real juxtaposition between the intelligentsia, right? The sort of educated classes sitting around in the coffee shops, and then the poor laboring classes that, sometimes didn't even, a lot of them couldn't even afford a room in an apartment. They would rent beds by the hour and would kind
Hmm.
of sleep in shifts in beds in apartments.
Wow, okay.
So you have, yeah, actually, I think it would be interesting to do an episode on that at some point as well.
Yeah, that strikes me as very like Brooklyn garment district image kind of thing. But okay, like industrial revolution-y or whatever kind of stuff. Okay, huh?
Yeah, somehow I would expect it earlier, maybe,
Yeah.
or I don't know, Vienna you just associate with, beautiful buildings and culture and opera and music, and nobody ever really talks about the, factories and the people that couldn't even afford a room. But you did have a lot of that actually, and so you had a real housing crisis at this time in the city as well.
Okay.
So anyway, Dr. Karl Lueger is kind of an interesting character. So just to give like a very brief summary of the guy,
Mm-hmm.
but then I'll get more into the details. On the one hand, he's known for helping to develop the city during this time. So, it was a time where a lot of things were changing, the city was growing, and he was quite instrumental in helping to develop the city. But he also became extremely known for his anti Semitism
Hmm.
and for kind of sowing the seeds for World War II down the line.
Hmm.
So that's the basic outline of why he's pretty controversial.
Okay.
To get into him a little bit, he was born in 1844 in Vienna. He studied law. He considered himself to be an advocate for the little people. So he really did see himself as sort of a populist in that sense, or that he was, looking out for kind of the working class, the little people.
Okay.
So this term, an advocate for the little people, is something that he said about himself. And he took that from more or less from his role model and mentor, which was this Jewish doctor in the city who called himself the god of the little people.
Okay.
Super modest all around.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, okay, half right. All right, on a good track, whatever.
Yeah. But Luiga kind of followed this doctor guy into political life because the doctor also ended up being a politician. And so Luiga saw him as a bit of a role model and his mentor. And
Mm-hmm.
he was Jewish and they were very, very close. But down the line, of course, their relationship fragmented mostly because of Luiga's policies later.
Hmm.
But even getting into political life was not straightforward for him. I mean, initially he was elected to the city council in 1875 and he served on the city council for the rest of his life, actually, I think with one short break. But becoming mayor ended up being quite difficult. So in 1875, he joins the city council. Then one of the main things that happens is that in 1885, I didn't even know this existed. Probably, I don't know if the US ever had this or not, but apparently Vienna or Austria at the time had a system where in order to vote, you had to have a certain amount of money.
Um,
So you basically had to pay to vote.
okay. I mean, I don't know about pay to vote, but sort of, right? In the US, didn't you have to own land for a while? Like, you had to be a man, you had to, like, the rules were kind of like these unattainable things for swaths of the population. Sort of sounds familiar, I guess, but okay, I don't know about, like, pay that day or whatever this is. Never heard of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think both are sort of, very limited in
Yeah.
terms of being actual democracies. In Vienna, at least at the time, you had to pay 10 guilders
Okay.
to vote. And then in 1885, that was changed to 5 guilders. So that opened up the vote for a lot of people who had previously not been able to vote.
Sorry, just for perspective, like, do you know, 5 guilders then, would that be like 5 grand? You know what I mean? Is that, like, I want to bust out some obscure calculator.
Yeah, you probably could look up what sort of the average wage would have been at the time.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't look into that. The only thing that I kind of can say about it is that obviously the amount that you had to pay was cut in half. And so that did open up the vote for a lot of people who had previously not been able to afford it.
Okay.
And it does seem like 5 guilders was like much more affordable to people
Hmm.
because part of what made Luiga then popular was that a lot of the new people who could now vote were more from the working class. They tended to be more kind of anti industrialist, anti Semitic as well. And this kind of became his base because he had very much supported reducing the amount that you had to pay.
Okay, now why does this sound familiar?
Yeah,
You
there's
know.
some modern, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Some parallels in some places. Okay, continue.
Yes, I think you can find some parallels here with more modern day movements, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, basically, this helped to make him popular. And in the end, in 1888, so a few years after that, his party won the majority of the seats in the city council, and that meant that they could select the mayor. And so they elected him to be the mayor.
Okay.
But it wasn't that simple. So at the time, Austria was still a monarchy, and so you still had the emperor, and it was Franz Josef at the time. And so
Mm-hmm.
the mayor of Vienna had to be confirmed by the emperor, and he just flat refused to confirm him. He got elected 3 times, and every
Okay.
time the emperor was like, "No, I'm not having him," because he considered him to be very dangerous and thought that he was a revolutionary and thought that he would
Huh.
basically upset the order and just refused to confirm him. So he was elected initially in 1888 and he only became mayor in 1897.
Wow.
So almost 10
Okay.
years later, there were other people in between who then were
Yeah.
mayor. But because the emperor just refused to confirm him, he just had to kind of like, I don't know, keep trying.
Damn.
And then he only actually became mayor in 1897 because the Pope Leo the Eighth,
Oh my God.
personally interceded on his behalf and said, he needs to become mayor. And I don't know, somehow convinced the emperor to then actually confirm him.
Wow. Okay. I mean, a lot was different. Some things the same. That sounds like, what, 10 years of dysfunction? I guess I've lived in cities like that, but okay. Damn, yes. A huge city, too. And I guess I just think now, like in our modern times, I'm like, sure, the monarch had different power and involvement, but I feel like I just always sort of assume it's something like the British monarchy, where it's like they send, someone to the king or queen. They're like, yeah, sure, okay. Yeah, it's interesting to see, to like think of them as so activist to say no for 10 years. Like, wow, okay.
Yeah,
Emperor really thought he was still emperoring then.
I mean, it was towards the very end of the monarchy, but he was asserting his power, I guess.
Yeah, involved. All right.
But I would have assumed it would be a rubber stamp too, right? That
Yeah,
like maybe he doesn't like the guy, but his ability to actually prevent him from becoming mayor, I would assume would
yeah.
be fairly limited.
Right, like he would be doing empire stuff. He wouldn't be doing like, local sewage and the stuff that the mayor would be doing. But okay.
Right. So either, I mean, I don't know. I don't know too much about this. I don't know if he just was that activist or if he really just disliked him so much and thought that he was, so potentially dangerous that he had to sort of make a stand.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, he did manage to push it out by 10, well, 9 years, but then the good old Pope intervened.
Okay. The Pope in Vienna city affairs. Okay, that sounds like an interesting angle. Didn't even know that would ever be a topic. All right.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure how that happened either, but apparently you could get the Pope involved at some point, and that seemed to have worked because he then did
Gosh.
become
All
mayor.
right.
So, as the mayor, I mean, already before he was part of so his party was the Christian Social Party, and he was an extremely overzealous Catholic and was very
Hmm.
into the whole religious side of things. But on the whole, when he first became mayor, he did do some things that actually even today you can see the legacy of in the city. So he improved the water supply in the city, and the Viennese are obsessed with their water. I mean, I don't know if you remember when you were here. I probably also brought it up that the water in Vienna is extremely good, and people are very into it.
Actually, yeah, I have some memory of that. Like, okay.
Yeah, and that comes a little bit from this time because he, I don't know, improved the water supply. And the water actually comes from outside of Vienna, like from the mountains. So it's mountain water, and it does have good quality. And then
Okay.
he also improved some gas and electrical works. He introduced the electrified tram into the city. So public transport doesn't totally come from his time because there were horse-drawn trams before that, already in the 1860s, I think.
Okay.
But the electrified trams came during his period, or the first ones of them anyway. And then I think part of what you still can see in the city is that he really conceived of Vienna as a garden city, and he built a lot of parks and gardens and green space in the city, or at least prevented it from being turned into, urban development.
Okay, and I don't know like the timeline of all of that, but that sounds kind of cutting edge maybe for this time.
Yeah, I think the Garden City stuff was already in the air. I think there was this French architect
Okay.
who was very big on the Garden City. I think it was around that time that this was sort of
Okay.
becoming, and also in Paris, it kind of grew out of this whole concept, I think. I mean, this is going back to something I have not researched in a long time, but I did write a paper about it at one point. Um,
Okay, so you knew at one point. That's enough for me.
Good enough.
Okay.
But you have in Paris, for example, these broad avenues.
Uh-huh.
And there was this whole movement about like, okay, having broad avenues and then parks, and kind of making things easily or well connected. And Vienna took up some of those ideas as well. And I think that was kind of around the end of the the end of the 1800s that
Okay.
became like a kind of a popular thing. So, um, and then he also was very, very popular with the ladies. We should not overlook this part
Oh, wow. Okay.
because he was considered very handsome. He was called Der schöne Karl, which means the handsome Karl, and
Hmm.
women seemed to really like him, which wasn't that useful to him because women couldn't vote at the time. But he still kind of played to the women
Oh.
because he figured that the women could probably, to some extent, influence their husbands or their sons to vote for him. So, he had a whole kind of female following as well. And yeah, ultimately he died in 1910 from diabetes while he was still in office. So he died in office at the age of 66, and then
Hmm.
that was, of course, the end of his term as well. So that's the basic outlines. But what makes him controversial is that he became very associated with anti-Semitic groups already quite early on in his political career. There's discussions or debate in academic circles about was he really that anti-Semitic or was he just an opportunist? to some extent, he realized that this base of his,
Right.
this kind of working class group that could now vote, that had previously not been able to vote, that anti-Semitism basically worked with them and that it played well to his base. And I don't know, for me, this question of was he really that anti-Semitic, like did he really believe it, or was he just an opportunist, is kind of beside the point, because at the end of the day, the outcome is the same, right? And it's like, does it really matter that much if he like really believed it, or if he just stoked the fires and didn't, like, who cares? At the end of the day,
Exactly. Like, oh, he didn't believe any of it. Like, what does that change? I mean, even historically, I'm not really sure. Looking back, yeah. So I'm agreeing. Yeah. Anyway.
yeah, at the end of the day, whether he did it out of like pure conviction or opportunism, the outcome is that he helped to, turn up the heat on something that was already bubbling, and where you really should have been turning down the heat, he was turning up the heat. And, ultimately, he actually also inspired Hitler, like directly. Hitler
Wow.
lived in the city of Vienna from 1907 to 1913.
Okay.
So that was the very last few years when Lueger was the
Hmm.
mayor. And he later said that he saw Lueger as an inspiration for his own anti Semitic views.
Wow. Okay.
So to my mind, it's completely irrelevant whether this was, opportunistic or, a true belief.
Yeah.
If you're inspiring Hitler with your ideas, you're on the wrong track, and it doesn't matter why.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. I've never heard of this connection. All right. Interesting.
Yeah, there is this interesting fact that a couple of very influential people, or like people that everybody know in history, all lived in Vienna around like at the same time. And I think it was the year 1913. And now I'm not going to remember who all it was, but it was definitely Hitler,
Are you saying it's like Hitler and Trotsky and is it like
Lenin, I think, Freud,
I feel like I've heard this, yeah, this like factoid for a while or once or twice, yeah.
whatever, like a group of historical figures, and they were all sort of in Vienna at the same time.
Hmm.
So yeah, Hitler was one of them as well. Although I mean, Hitler, as much as we Austrians try to pretend he's German, he's actually Austrian, so it's not that surprising that he lived in Vienna.
Well, yeah, I want to circle back to that actually. I don't know, want to like cut you off here. But yeah, I think as an American, and I'm not, somebody who's particularly interested in World War II or Hitler or something. So maybe that's common knowledge in that group. But I feel like the Austrian connection, right, is often so kind of shrouded, right? Where it's like, oh, there was like this Anschluss kind of thing, and then like we just were taken along for the ride, and then we were attacked, and you know what I mean? Like we're Austria. Whether it's my own ignorance, whether there's some design to that, I sort of like unclear. But to hear this fact, like I've never heard that, right? It's like, oh, there was this mayor, and then Hitler lived there at the same time, and he straight up said that it was an influence. I've never heard that. So anyway, interesting. It just like makes me more interested sort of about the Austrian piece of that.
Yeah, there's a big Austrian piece to it, and it's not just your ignorance. That's the narrative that Austria promoted for a long time, I think, quite actively.
Okay.
The fact that Hitler is Austrian
Hmm.
is not something that is, denied or anything. But, to the extent that people think that he's German, Austria is not disabusing anybody of that notion. And I think
Mm-hmm.
into the 80s in school, the narrative really was that Austria was the first victim of World War II, basically, or of Hitler because of the Anschluss.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, on some level, maybe you could make that argument because, of course, Parliament dissolved and, it was quite a young,
Mm-hmm. And the Habsburgs were like, "Hey, stop,"
well,
or
the Habsburgs
something,
had
right?
been gotten rid of by that point.
Okay. Okay. Maybe another thing I don't know. All
Well,
right.
yeah, because the Habsburg Empire collapsed in 1918 at the end of World War One, right? So the Habsburgs no longer had any, I mean, most of them left anyway, and they had no claim to, they couldn't use their titles anymore, and they had no claim to really any,
Right.
they had no say anymore.
Okay.
But no, Austria's very happy to have you think that Austria was a victim of the war.
Okay.
And
That's like another series of episodes. It sounds like.
yeah, yeah. And kind of
All right.
paper over the fact that, oh yeah, Hitler actually was from here, and that he actually, and not just him, but this anti-Semitism was very apparent already at the time, and it was kind of bubbling up. And people like Lueger helped to stoke those fires, and that did help to
Mm.
inspire what came later.
Okay.
And so the current controversy about him, so at the time that was already quite controversial. On the one hand, he was controversial enough that the emperor wouldn't even confirm him as mayor. And then he was also controversial because of the whole Jewish anti-Semitism side of things. And he was often questioned about his anti-Semitic views, and he would be quite dismissive about it. He once like famously declared that he decides who is a Jew, which is
Huh? The mayor?
I mean, I think he meant it more on like a personal level because he had a lot of friends who actually were Jewish, and then people would kind of ask him about it. And so he seems to be, I mean, at the end of the day, he just seems to be like a very slippery character who just wants to get ahead and will do whatever is politically useful to him.
Damn. Okay. Yeah.
So already controversial at the time, but today he continues to be controversial for obviously more or less the same reasons, but because there are various memorials to him in the city, or there have been various memorials, some of them no longer exist. And so that today continues to be this controversy because in the central cemetery of Vienna, the Zentralfriedhof. That's the largest cemetery in the city. It's
Okay.
massive. It's to the south of the city, and it's really there's hundreds of thousands of graves
Mm-hmm.
there. I mean, it's massive. It's I don't know, 2.5 like square kilometers or
Wow.
something. I mean, it's like a huge area. Have you ever seen the movie The Third Man, actually?
No.
We should do an episode on that too, because it's a really good movie and it's
Yeah, you've talked about
based
it.
on a true story. The reason I mention it here is because the opening and closing shot of that film is from the Central Cemetery, and you have these like
Okay.
huge avenues that are tree lined and tons of graves on both sides, and there's very famous people who are buried there. Beethoven is buried there, Schubert, Hedy Lamarr, Mozart has an honorary grave. I mean, he was actually buried in like a pauper's grave, like in a mass
Hmm.
grave, but they gave him like a an honorary thing there. So anybody who's ever been anybody in Vienna basically is buried at the Central Cemetery or has an honorary grave there. And
Hmm.
in the very center, where kind of all of these avenues that go through the various sections of the graveyard, where they all converge in the middle, there is a large church that stands there, which was built between 1908 and 1911 by guess
Okay.
who was mayor at the time? Our good friend Karl Lueger. And
Yeah, sexy Carl.
Sexy Carl, exactly. Sexy Carl was building the church. So the church is officially called the St. Charles Borromeo Church, and St. Charles Borromeo was, I don't know, some saint from the 16th century who is the patron saint of bishop, and I think he was like very big in the Counter Reformation, whatever. There's quite a lot of churches that are dedicated to him. But the point here is that there was a lot of speculation, actually even already at the time, that, Charles and Carl are actually the same name. Karl is the German version and Charles is the English version. And so Karl
Hmm.
Lueger, more or less, couldn't directly dedicate a church to himself because I think that would have been too much even for him. That would have been real grandiose. But
Yeah,
he
damn.
chose Charles instead to kind of link it to him as well. And so the church was built from 1908 until 1911. He died in 1910, and he's actually buried in the church in a room directly under the altar.
Go figure. Yeah. So I Googled this. I'm looking at pictures. This is not like a minor chapel. It's kind of like a big dome vibe.
Yeah, it's grand. It's one of these domed churches. It's not like a small little church or chapel. Like it's a legit large church.
Yeah. Okay. Because part of me was kind of thinking, like, yeah, like a little mausoleum kind of thing.
No, no.
No, I'm kind of like, okay, what graves were removed to make this? And this is like a serious lawn.
No, Sexy Carl needs, a full-blown domed church.
Yes. Yes.
So he's buried in that church, which is also a bit unusual because politicians don't normally get buried in some grandiose church that they have built.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. I thought that's kind of like, religious figures.
And the royal family, yes, they are buried
Oh, yeah.
in
Okay.
well, actually it's a bit complicated in Vienna because their organs get separated from their bodies, but the bodies are buried in
Of
the
course. Of
as
course.
as it is.
What the fuck?
But their bodies are buried in the St. Stephen's Cathedral, which is like the central church of the whole city. But
Hmm.
still, this is like a random mayor of Vienna who was mayor for what, 13 years.
Yeah.
It doesn't normally warrant some grandiose church to be built. I mean, it wasn't officially built for him, but he did manage to get himself buried there. And on top of that, that's not the only thing. He's also depicted in a painting that is behind the altar. So behind the altar of the church, there's this like large painting, and his face appears in it.
Okay, I'm looking through these Wikipedia pictures.
I mean, I've been there to the church, and it's been pointed out to me, and it's yeah, it's like just a face of
His
like an,
face.
60-ish-year-old guy. So he had the painters put him into the painting
Huh.
behind the
Okay.
altar, which normally is always a very religious scene, right? And I think it is some kind of religious scene. I can't remember what the
Yeah.
actual thing is, but I'm sure it's some kind of.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I see. Yes. So I'm looking at this picture. There's like an angel, there's all this gilding, and there's that kind of like, if you've been to any kind of Byzantine-ish thing, often there's like, I mean, this is kind of in the nerdy weeds here, right? But there's like somebody who's like handing the church to Jesus or whatever. There's like a little model of the church. There's this random dude with like a beard that does not match any of Jesus's styling, from like the year zero or whatever. Like this looks way more modern. I'm guessing it's that dude.
Yeah, I think it
Okay, I feel
is.
like I can pick it out. Wow. Yeah, it is like it doesn't jump out at you if you're just kind of spending 1 minute in the church, but if you're looking at any of these paintings, there's somebody like from another time just randomly there. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow. All
that's
right.
that's our good man Carl, I
Damn.
think.
Yeah.
So he had, I think, probably a very inflated sense of self and, these kind of grandiose ideas about how he should be remembered. And so that church officially is called the St. Charles Borromeo Church, but it is often called the Dr. Karl Lueger Memorial Church. So that name has kind of stuck. He is still buried there. He is still visible in the painting behind the altar. So none of that has been changed. And that actually hasn't really been a
Hmm.
controversy as far as I have gathered. That just sort of is there. I think a lot of people
Yeah.
don't know about it because it's, in the cemetery. It's not super central to the city. I think a lot of people are just sort of unaware of this story. The thing that was much more controversial that did get changed was, so you have historically what is now the first
Mm-hmm.
district of Vienna. That was the old city,
Okay.
right? And so around that you had the city walls. And those city walls were torn down in the 1860s. And now, instead of the city
Right.
walls, you have this ring road. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a road that is kind of a circle that goes around the center of the city. And it's called the ring, but each section of the ring has its own name. And one section was called the Dr. Karl
Okay.
Lueger ring. And it's the part of the ring where the University of Vienna is located. So actually, when I started studying here in 2008, the address of the university was Dr. Karl Lueger Ring because that's just what that part of the street was called. And that became quite controversial. On the one
Mm-hmm.
hand, street names anyway have been a bit of a controversy. There's been a kind of in the south of Vienna, there were long standing controversies about which language to put things in because there's like a Slovenian speaking population. And so there were all these discussions about whether it should be in Slovenian and German. And, street signs
Mm.
became kind of like a hot topic. And, just how you honor
Yeah.
people and how you name the streets also became much more of a discussion. And so in 2012, the name of that section of the ring road was changed to the Universitätsring, which means the university ring, which makes more sense. I mean, it's like, yeah, the university's
Mm-hmm.
there, okay, straightforward. And I think it was actually additionally more controversial that, like, exactly this part of the ring was named after this very controversial anti Semitic mayor. And that's where the university was, which should
Mm-hmm.
really be the place where you critically question things and,
Yeah. Some dissonance there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right, some disconnect of this should be academic and intellectual and, questioning and, really looking behind the narratives and everything. And then the address of the university actually was named after this, like, very, problematic figure in history. So they did manage to get that changed. And since 2012, it now has a new name, which is, yeah, the University Ring. And the latest controversy or ongoing controversy is a statue that exists that was erected in 1926, which is a statue of Luega,
Okay.
and it's at the very south part of the inner city. So, of course, before you had the ring road, when you still had the city
Mm-hmm.
walls, you had various gates in the city wall where people could enter and leave. And one of those gates was called Stubentor. Tor means gate, And so Stubentor is still, like the metro station is called Stubentor. It's the very southern part of the center of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a statue that is there of him, dedicated also to him. And so, as we know, not only in Austria but elsewhere, statues have become, a real flashpoint as well, and very controversial in terms of what they represent and what are we remembering and
Yeah.
why, what are we valuing as a society.
So, like, is it just a statue of him? Is it a statue of him doing something, like, even more, offensive? He's like,
No, it's a statue of him standing. Like he has a very determined stance, more or less. I mean, it does show him as sort of like a powerful figure. It's this like big pedestal, and then he's standing on top of it as, I mean, I assume,
okay,
98% of people who walk past this thing don't know who he is
all
and
right.
don't check and don't care. I mean, that's how these things go. But still, if you look at it, you would be like, okay, this is obviously an important person, depicted in a very respectable fashion, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, you just hear the parallels, right, to, you know, Americans grappling with, right, the legacy of the Confederacy, right? Or feel like in Eastern Europe, grappling with Soviet monuments, stuff like that. Yeah, okay, like all these Western countries, we kind of have our things that we're processing right now. I think in the US, moving this stuff into museums, right, that's been one of the solutions, quote unquote. I mean, I think that makes sense. It's like, yeah, there's no history erasing. It's interesting to see how, we all deal with that. Here, yeah, moving to museums, it seems like in like Lithuania, they just destroy it, right? Like, I don't, or there's that one country, maybe it's Czech Republic or something, that they have that huge Soviet monument, like graveyard theme park thing. I forget where that is exactly.
I think it's Budapest,
Is
or
it? Okay.
I think Budapest.
So yeah, it's interesting like how we process all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, laying the seeds or, the groundwork for some pretty intense anti Semitism, then seeing where it went, that seems like an open and shut case to me. But yeah, hey, there's different cultures. They deal with it differently. Vienna is for Viennese, and
Yeah, like with all of these things, I mean, for me, that's also a pretty open and shut case.
yeah,
It led to genocide. I mean, you can't
yeah,
really paper over that. And okay, he was not directly involved, but he very much, and this is really undisputed, I think, allowed this kind of thing to flourish
mm-hmm.
and did not tamp down on anti-Semitism, but to the contrary, actually kind of encouraged it or promoted it because it helped his own political career.
Yeah, showed that it could be harnessed
Yeah,
for power. I mean,
super
yeah.
dangerous. But yeah, of course, you would then always have the people that say, well, but he did a lot for the city. You always have these arguments, right? In any case,
Mm-hmm.
that statue still stands, but has become this kind of flashpoint. So it hasn't been torn down or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. I think it would actually be very hard to tear down, but it has constantly been vandalized the last couple of years. So people, write graffiti on it. And the kind of most common thing that has happened over the last year or so is that it repeatedly, people just dump black paint all over it.
Okay, that's what we have with some Confederate monuments here. Even in Seattle, there's one that I think it's like it gets pink paint on it a lot and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like a constant discussion and it's in the news and there's these constant
Mm.
questions about what to do with it. And to your point, putting it in a museum, that's kind of one of the standard approaches. But the latest suggestion that they've made now with this statue that I find kind of interesting, I'm not totally sure how I feel about it, is to actually leave the statue where it is, but reposition it so that it's standing at an angle, so that he's not standing straight, but he's kind of like tipped a bit to the side.
Hmm.
And the idea behind that is to raise questions so that when you look at the statue, you kind of think, okay, it's off kilter, something's wrong here. Like, what is the deal? Why is this guy not standing properly? And then there would be some kind of plaque with some information. And so the idea is to at least put
Okay.
into the consciousness of the people that it's not just a normal statue, but that it irritates you in some way and that you ask some questions and try to figure out why is this guy
Yeah.
looking like he's about to fall over.
Yeah, because for me, honestly, like, it doesn't feel good to just take it away and then no one think about it, right? it seems better that it would be there than you would know about this person, and you wouldn't be like, oh, there's a statue, therefore we're celebrating. I'm like, well, there's a statue, so you remember it, you get this additional information, then you know it. It seems better that people walk around Vienna aware of it,
Yeah, I think that's the idea.
versus it's like out of sight, out of mind.
Right? And that's the really hard part about it is, yeah, if you
Yeah.
just remove it, then it's like, okay, we can just close the door on that and,
As
just
far as I'm concerned, we've solved it right now. Okay? So run for mayor. Okay? Okay?
yeah. I mean, not that this was my suggestion, but sure, I'll sign on it to it and run for mayor.
That's where this is going. Okay?
So yeah, that's basically the story of like where it kind of stands today. So on the one hand, the guy did
Mm-hmm.
legitimately do things for the city that I think to some extent are what make the city very livable today still. Not only him, I mean, there were later people as well, but sort of, the first years, the first decades of the 20th century really established a lot of what makes Vienna what it is today and what makes it so livable. And so he was a part of that.
Hmm.
But like I said, he did kind of really stoke the fires of anti-Semitism and, help to bring about really the darkest chapter of Austrian history and Viennese history. And so, yeah, the question is, how do you remember that? Or in what way should that be contextualized? In what way do you kind of
Yeah.
deal with that sort of history? I mean, every country deals with that on some level. And Austria, so far, for the most part, I think has been mostly very successful in trying to wash their hands of all these things and pretend like it was all the Germans and Austria had nothing to do with anything.
Hmm.
But slowly, even Austria has to reckon with its own past.
Yeah. God, there's a lot there. Okay.
So much.
Yeah, but okay. Yeah, I'm just sort of left with this feeling. I'm like, okay, Vienna, there was a lot going on for such a long time. And I mean, there still is. It's still a prominent city, right? But like, especially back then, lots of characters with crazy destinies, maybe even in this awkward, well, I guess pre-war period, but
I think
yeah.
particularly in this time there was a lot happening
Hmm.
because it was sort of
Yeah.
it was the very end of the monarchy. All the alliances and all these things that were happening that led up to World War One were already in play on some level. But then you have Vienna in particular as still the capital of this large monarchy that is about to collapse, but of course people don't know that at the time. And the city's still growing, and it's this kind of booming period for culture and coffee houses and literature and all the like intelligentsia kind of stuff and revolutionary ideas. So you have all of that happening, then you have all the working class kind of elements bubbling underneath of people not getting ahead. And so to tie it a little bit back to the point about, people couldn't even afford a room in an apartment or even a bed, that was fully theirs. They had to, basically rent beds by the hour. That element of the city was juxtaposed against these like monumental palaces that the richer people in the city were building at this time
Mm-hmm.
because when the
Yeah.
when the ring road was built, so that was the 1860s, in the decades after that, 1870s, 1880s, so that's really kind of 10, 20 years before the period we're talking about here, all these people started building these massive palaces along the ring, and you still see them today.
Oh.
I mean, they're like apartment buildings and office buildings and whatever now, and you don't notice them because they just kind of are what the city looks like. But that didn't exist before. And all of that was built around this time. And then you have these like very poor working class people that are just, probably feel like they're completely shut out from that and realistically probably were. And, that helps to really create this cauldron, I think, of discontent, of, a really two tiered society. And I think it shows you where things lead when things get very unequal and you have very, very prominent displays of wealth next to people that don't have an apartment and like are not anywhere near ever being able to afford one.
Yeah, and then the characters who pop up who can somehow navigate
Yeah, yeah.
those like tinderbox situations, right? Like this dude, Carl. Like, oh, I know how to get ahead in here and get my own church for fuck's sake.
Which I'm gonna then be buried in.
Oh, keep swearing here. Yes, wow.
Yeah, so that's good old sexy Carl, handsome Carl. That's his story
Yeah.
and the ongoing controversies around him.
Okay, interesting. I would say, I'm trying to look for some reason that I knew 1% of this, but I didn't. Okay. Okay, wait. I knew of the water because you said it a lot. Didn't know who, but the water was great. I guess that's the only piece I knew going in. I know more now. I am going to do some more Googling.
So that's it with Sexy Carl, who turns out wasn't that sexy after all. That's it for today's show. Thanks for listening, and if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it or leave us a 5-star review. And if you didn't like it, that's cool. You don't have to worry about that review.
Right. You can find us at Vienna Past and Present on social medias or Vienna Past and Pres on Instagram. Send us your show ideas at viennapastandpresent@gmail.com.
Auf Wiedersehen, pfiat euch, Baba.
Bye.